Hey everyone, if you enjoy my park ranger horror stories, I've started uploading them on Spotify too. My YouTube channel got demonetized, so I'm putting a lot more focus into Spotify now. You'll find daily scary stories there with longer, darker, and more immersive horror content. If you want to support the channel, please go follow the Spotify page and leave a 5-star rating. It genuinely helps me keep making these stories. The Spotify link is in the description and pinned comment. Turn off the lights. Put on your headphones and I'll see you there. The worst thing I ever saw in Big Bend wasn't a body. It was a man digging a hole in a canyon 800 feet below me, who looked up, found my eyes through a pair of binoculars from that distance, in the last light of the day, and went right back to digging. Like I wasn't even worth stopping for. I need to back up and tell this in order, because if I just told you that part, you'd think it was nothing. A guy digging a hole. So what? But by the time I saw that, I already knew what was usually in holes like that one. And I was starting to understand why nobody had ever stopped him. I'd been a law enforcement ranger for almost 20 years by the time I transferred to Big Bend. Before that, I was at Shenandoah, back east, Green Mountains, lots of visitors, lots of noise. I asked for a hardship posting, somewhere remote, somewhere quiet. Big Bend was about as remote as it gets in the lower 48. I'm not going to get into all the reasons I wanted that. Some of it was personal. Some of it I still don't talk about. But I will say this. I wanted a place where I wouldn't have to sleep near trees anymore. Big Bend doesn't have many trees. It has desert and mountains and a river. That sounded fine to me. I drove in from Marathon, Texas in early March. If you've never made that drive, I want you to picture 40 miles of nothing, not nothing like empty fields. Nothing like no gas stations, no houses, no other cars, just 2-lane blacktop running straight through scrub and rock, with the Chisos Mountains sitting on the horizon the whole time, getting bigger so slow you can't tell it's happening. By the time you hit the park entrance, you feel like you've crossed into a different country. Cell service drops out around mile 20. It doesn't come back. My first week, I stepped up in the Chisos Basin campground while they sorted out my housing. Basin's the only spot in the park with any trees to speak of. Oaks, some junipers, up high enough that it actually gets cold at night, even in early spring. I remember sitting outside my tent the second night, watching the canyon walls go from tan to orange to almost red as the sun dropped, and thinking, okay, I can do this. It was quiet in a way I hadn't felt in years. Too quiet looking back. But at the time it just felt like peace. The ranger station is at a place called Panther Junction, more or less the middle of the park. It's not much to look at. Low buildings, government tan, parking lot full of white trucks. Inside, it's exactly what you'd expect. Old desks, a coffee maker that had to be from the Bush administration, a wall of radios that crackled all day with traffic from patrols out on the river road or up in the basin. The outgoing chief ranger was a man named Martin Pacheco, 67 years old, 2 weeks from retirement, and I want to tell you, I have met a lot of people getting ready to retire. Some of them are sad about it. Some of them are excited. Martin was relieved. That's the word. Relieved. The way you are when you've been holding your breath without realizing it, and you finally let it out. He walked me through everything that first day. Evidence locker, weapons safe, the file room where all the current case paperwork lived. He was thorough, careful. The kind of guy who double-checks a lock even after he's already checked it once. At the end of the tour, there was a door at the end of a hallway with stairs going down, and I asked him what was down there. Old records, he said. Pre-digital. Nothing you'll need. That was it. He didn't linger on it, didn't make it weird at the time. He just moved on to the next thing, which was showing me how the radio repeaters worked out past Castellon. I didn't think about the basement again for almost a month. My third week on the job, I drew a patrol on the River Road. If you don't know Big Bend, the River Road is a 51-mile dirt track that runs along the Rio Grande on the U.S. side, through some of the most isolated country in the park. High-clearance vehicles only, and even then you're white-knuckling it through washouts and gravel the whole way. You can go hours without seeing another person. On one side, you've got the river, lined with this thick grass called carrizo cane, grows 12, 15 feet tall in places, so dense you can't see 10 feet into it. On the other side, just open desert and scrub running up toward the mountains. It was about 5:40 in the evening, getting toward that orange light right before dusk when I saw him. He was off trail, maybe 200 yards out in the scrub, walking. Tall, I'd guess 6'2", 6'3", thin build, wearing khaki work clothes and one of those wide-brimmed hats you see on old-timers out here. He was walking south, toward the river. Now, Out on the river road, seeing a person on foot, off trail, with no vehicle anywhere near, that's not nothing. Could be a migrant crossing, could be someone in trouble, could be somebody up to no good. I keyed my radio, called it in, gave my position, and got out to make contact. I called out to him. Park service, standard stuff. He didn't turn around, didn't speed up either, just kept that same steady walking pace, like he hadn't heard me, or like he'd heard me and didn't care. I followed him on foot for about 400 yards. The ground out there is rough. Volcanic rock, Ocotillo, places where the desert just opens up into these little arroyos you don't see until you're right on top of them. I kept losing him for a second behind a rise and then picking him back up. He never looked back, never changed pace. Then he walked into a stand of carrizo cane near the river, and he didn't come out the other side. I waited. Watched that wall of cane for a good 10 minutes. Walked the edge of it both directions, looking for a gap, a trail, anything. Cane like that, 15 feet tall and thick as your wrist in places. A man can move through it, sure, if he knows where the gaps are. But I didn't hear him moving. No rustling, no birds spooking out of it, nothing. He was just gone. I went back to my truck, called it in again, and that night I wrote up an incident report. Unidentified individual, possible undocumented border crossing, last seen entering riverine vegetation, no further contact. Standard language. The kind of thing that gets filed and forgotten, because honestly, it happens. People cross that river all the time, going both directions, and most of the time it's nobody's business, and nothing comes of it. The report got acknowledged the next morning, a little checkbox in the system, and that was that. For 2 weeks, nothing happened at all. Then Dennis Kowalski didn't show up for his shift. Dennis was a campground host, volunteer position, the kind where you get a free RV site in exchange for checking people in, cleaning fire rings, that sort of thing. He was in his 60s, retired from somewhere up in Oklahoma, drove down every winter with his wife to host at Rio Grande Village. His wife had gone back up to visit their daughter for a couple weeks, so he was out there alone. Nice guy. Talked your ear off about his grandkids if you let him. I'd had coffee with him twice. He didn't open the camp store Tuesday morning, didn't answer his radio. By that afternoon, another ranger went to check on him, and here's the part that I want you to sit with for a second. His trailer was locked from the outside. His truck was parked right where it always was. His wallet, his keys, his reading glasses, all sitting on the little table inside, visible through the window, like he'd just stepped out for a minute and never come back. We ran the standard missing person protocol. Grid search around the campground and the nearby trails. Hot Springs Trail, the Daniels Ranch area, down along the river. Dogs came in from Brewster County. Helicopter did a flyover of the river corridor. Nothing. No tracks that led anywhere. No sign of him at all. After about 5 days, the search scaled back to what they call a extended awareness status, which is a nice way of saying, we're not finding him, and we're going to keep looking in the background. But the active search is over. I remember sitting in my truck that night with the case file open, looking at the dates, and I noticed something that made my stomach drop a little. Dennis went missing on a Tuesday morning. My sighting, the man walking south into the cane, had been the previous Saturday evening. I did the math. 68 hours. Just shy of 3 days between my report and Dennis disappearing. Roughly half a mile down the river from where I'd lost the guy in the cane. I told myself it was nothing. Coincidence. People cross that river all the time and it has nothing to do with anything. But it nagged at me. So a couple days later, I went down to the basement. I want to be honest with you, I didn't go down there because I suspected anything specific. I went down there because Martin had told me not to bother with it. And that's exactly the kind of thing that sticks in your head when you're the new person and you're trying to learn how a place really works, underneath the official version. The basement at Panther Junction is about what you'd expect from a building that's been there since the 60s. Concrete floor, drop ceiling with half the tiles missing. That smell old paper gets after enough years. Kind of sweet and dusty at the same time. Rows of filing cabinets, most of them labeled by year. Maintenance logs, old visitor surveys. Budget paperwork going back to 1970-something. And then, in a cabinet labeled simply, Incident Historical, I found the first one within about 20 minutes. It was from 1994. A ranger named Boyd Sutter had filed a report, handwritten, on the old triplicate forms, describing an unidentified male, approx. 6'2", walking south toward the river near Boquillas Canyon. Same description. Cocky, wide-brimmed hat, walking, not responding to contact, disappearing into riverside vegetation. Stapled to the back of it was a typed memo from the superintendent at the time. 3 sentences, report reviewed, per regional directive, This report is to be sealed and removed from active files. Ranger Sutter has been reassigned to Blue Ridge Parkway, effective immediately. I sat down on an overturned crate and read that memo about 4 times. Then I started pulling more files, and once I knew what I was looking for, I started finding them fast, tucked into the backs of other folders, filed under wrong years, a few just loose in a banker's box marked Missy. By the time I stopped, I had 31 of them, spread out across a folding table I dragged over from the corner. 31 reports, going all the way back to 1993, up through one filed just 4 years before I'd arrived. Every single one described the same man. Same height, same build, same clothes, same hat. Always seen near dusk, always near the river, always walking south, always disappearing into the brush. And every single one had a memo attached, sealing it and noting that the reporting ranger had been transferred. Yellowstone, Acadia, Mammoth Cave, Blue Ridge again, all over the system. Every ranger who'd seen this man and written it down had been somewhere else within 6 months. I built a timeline that night, on the back of an old visitor survey, because it was the only paper I had handy, citing dates down one column. And then I went back through the missing persons files, which, it turns out, the park keeps a surprisingly thick folder of, for a place that gets so few visitors, and started cross-referencing. It took me a while to see it because the cases were so spread out, decades apart, different names, different circumstances. But once I lined the dates up, it was about as subtle as a punch in the face. 19 times over 31 years, within 72 hours of one of these sightings, a park employee had gone missing. Not visitors, employees. Seasonal trail crew, maintenance contractors, volunteer hosts like Dennis. People who work in a place like this for a season or two and then move on. People nobody's going to notice are gone for a good long while, if ever. People whose disappearance generates a couple of paragraphs in a local paper, if that. I found one more thing in that basement that night, and it's the one that stayed with me the longest. Buried in a box of old personnel files. These would have been sealed too, under privacy rules. Except apparently nobody in 1992 cared much about that. Was a folder for a man named Arthur Leland Marsh, hired as a seasonal maintenance worker at Big Bend in 1991. Inside was a black and white ID photo, the kind they used to staple right to the front of the form. Tall, thin, khaki uniform. And even in a grainy 30-year-old photo, even with a different hat, I recognized that face. It matched. Every description, every sketch some ranger had tried to draw in the margins of those 31 reports. It was the same man. The file said Arthur Marsh was terminated in 1992. Reason given, failure to report to duty. There was nothing after that. No forwarding address. No follow-up, nothing. He just stopped existing on paper. I sat in that basement until almost midnight. And the thing that scared me wasn't the man in the photograph. It was the paperwork. 31 reports, sealed. 19 people gone. And every single time, the system had worked perfectly. Not to find anyone, but to make sure nobody kept looking. The next morning, I tracked down Boyd Sutter. The 1994 report had his full name on it, and it didn't take much digging to find out he'd retired out of Blue Ridge Parkway a few years back and was living outside Asheville, North Carolina. I called the number I found for him, told him who I was, told him I was at Big Bend now, and asked if he had a few minutes to talk about something from a long time ago. There was a pause on the line, long enough that I thought he might just hang up. Big Bend, he said finally. Not a question, just repeating it, like the word itself meant something to him. I figured someone might call eventually. Took longer than I thought. I asked him about the report. About the man. I saw him 3 times, Boyd said. His voice was steady, but slow. The way people talk when they've gone over something 1,000 times in their own head and worn all the urgency off it. First time, I thought he was a hiker, off trail, maybe lost. Called out to him. He didn't answer. Second time, same thing, different spot, both times near dusk. Both times he just walked into the brush by the river, and that was it. And the third time? Third time he turned around and looked at me. I waited. He took a breath. His face was normal, Boyd said. I want you to understand that. Not scary, not whatever you're picturing. Just a man's face, weathered like he'd spent his whole life outdoors, ordinary, but his eyes, he stopped, started again. You ever watch a heron hunt? Standing real still in shallow water, and then its head moves, just slightly. Tracking something underwater that you can't even see yet? Yeah, that's how he looked at me. Like he already knew exactly where I was going to be next. I asked him what happened after that. Why he got transferred. My superintendent called me into his office a week later, Boyd said. Nice fella, actually. That's the part that always got me. He wasn't threatening me. He sat me down and he said, and I remember this word for word, because I've thought about it for 30 years, he said. Boyd, some things at Big Bend don't get reported, because reporting them causes more problems than it solves. And then he told me Blue Ridge had an opening, and asked if my wife liked mountains. Did you push back? I had a wife and 2 kids and a mortgage, he said. And I'd just had a man look at me like that. No, I took the transfer. We talked a little while longer. He asked if anyone had gone missing recently. I told him about Dennis. He went quiet again. And then he said something that I didn't fully understand at the time. And honestly, I almost didn't think about it again until much later. You should be careful with the personnel files, he said. If you find one for him, don't just look at the photo. I asked him what he meant. He said he had to go, said his wife was calling him for dinner, and he hung up before I could push him on it. I figured it was just an old man being cryptic, the way people sometimes get about things that scared them a long time ago. I didn't think much of it. I had bigger things on my mind. About a week after that call, I was up at the Santa Elena Canyon overlook at the end of my shift, just before sunset. If you've never been there, Santa Elena is this massive slot canyon where the Rio Grande cuts straight through 1,500 feet of limestone, walls going almost straight up on both sides. From the overlook, you're looking down into the canyon mouth, river running through the bottom, this little ribbon of green cane along the banks. It's one of the most photographed spots in the park. Usually there's a few cars there at sunset, people getting pictures. That evening I was alone. I had my binoculars out, just scanning, the way you do out of habit more than anything. When I picked him up, he was on the canyon floor, 1,500 feet below me, walking south along the river, same pace as always, same khaki, same hat, and this time he was carrying something. Took me a second to make it out through the binoculars in that fading light, but it was a shovel. I watched him walk to a spot where the canyon wall curved out, forming a kind of natural pocket above the waterline, an alcove, sheltered, the kind of spot you'd never notice unless you were right there or looking almost straight down on it from above, like I was. And then he started digging. I want to be clear about something. I did not move, I did not make a sound. I was 1,500 feet up, in low light, holding still binoculars against a rock for support. There is no way, a person should have been able to tell I was there. He dug for about 20 minutes, steady, unhurried, the kind of rhythm you only get from a man who's done a job 1,000 times and isn't in any kind of hurry to finish it. Then he stopped. He set the shovel down, and he looked up, straight at me, 1,500 feet, in the dark, through a pair of binoculars, and I felt it the same way you feel someone looking at you across a crowded room. He held it for maybe 3 seconds, and then he went back to digging. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my truck in the overlook parking lot until almost 2 in the morning, because I genuinely did not want to drive that road in the dark by myself, and I also did not want to be the only person up there if he decided to climb out. The next morning, I made some calls. I knew I couldn't go through my own chain of command, not after everything I'd found in that basement. So I called a guy I'd worked with years back at a training course, Ray Bernal, a law enforcement ranger over at Guadalupe Mountains, a couple hours north. Ray and I had stayed friendly. I told him enough, not everything, but enough, and he agreed to come down on his own time. He also knew a cadaver dog handler with the Brewster County Sheriff's Office, a woman named Patty Solis, who he said owed him a favor and wouldn't ask too many questions. It took us 4 days to put it together quietly, getting Ray down without it, showing up on anyone's radar, coordinating with Patty, figuring out the hike into that alcove, which from below is a rough scramble along the riverbank, no trail at all. We went in early on a Thursday morning, just the 3 of us, and Patty's dog, a black lab named Cooper. Cooper alerted within 30 seconds of reaching the alcove. Didn't even have to search. Went straight to a patch of disturbed soil at the base of the canyon wall and sat down, the way they're trained to do, staring at the ground like it owed him something. We started digging by hand, carefully, the way you're supposed to when you might be looking at a scene. About 18 inches down, we hit the first bone. It wasn't one set of remains. Patty could tell that almost right away, just from the bone density and the way things were layered. Different depths, different states of preservation, multiple individuals, buried at different times over what had to be years, maybe decades. We stopped digging, called it in properly at that point. Patty had standing with the county, so the recovery itself went through her, which kept it half a step away from my own superintendent's office, at least for a little while. The forensic work took a few weeks. Ray kept me updated, off the books. In the end, they identified remains from 5 individuals. 3 of them matched names from my list, 3 of the 19. Park employees, gone within 72 hours of a sighting, decades apart, never connected to each other in any official record, until I'd put that timeline together in the basement. The oldest remains were carbon dated to approximately 1993, the year after Arthur Marsh was terminated for failure to report to duty. I want to tell you that's where this turned into some big dramatic showdown. It didn't. The next part of this story is the part that scared me the most, and there's no monster in it at all. About a week after the remains were identified, my superintendent called me into her office. She told me calmly that my independent investigation was outside the scope of my authority, that the FBI had been made aware of the situation, which in my experience is the kind of phrase people use when they want you to think something is being handled, without actually telling you anything is being handled. She told me there was an opening at a park of my choosing, anywhere in the system, and that given everything I'd been through, a fresh start might be good for me. I sat there and I recognized it. 31 rangers before me, every one of them offered an exit, gently, by someone who probably believed they were doing the kind right thing. I said, no thank you. After that, things just closed up, slowly, quietly, the way a door swings shut on its own weight. My access to the basement archive got revoked the following week. New lock, new code, and when I asked about it, I was told it was routine record security. A few days after that, I went down anyway, using an old code that hadn't changed, and the filing cabinet with the 31 sealed reports was empty. Not the cabinet, the folder, gone. My own incident report, the one I'd filed back in March, about the man walking south into the cane, got flagged for supervisory review and disappeared into some queue that, as far as I know, it's still sitting in. And then Ray called me. He sounded tired. He said his own chain of command had reached out to him, not threatening, nothing like that. Just a quiet conversation about how he needed to stay in his lane regarding matters at another park. He told me he was sorry, and that he had to step back. So here's what I did, and I want you to know. Out of 31 rangers, in 31 years, as far as I could ever find, I was the first one who did this. I made copies, everything. The sighting reports I could still get my hands on. The timeline, the personnel file for Arthur Marsh, the forensic summary Ray had managed to get me before he had to back off. Photographs of the alcove, all of it. I made 3 full sets on paper, and I drove to Alpine on my day off and mailed them, actual mail, actual stamps, to 3 different addresses. The district attorney's office in Brewster County, a reporter at the El Paso Times who'd done some digging on border issues before, and my sister back in Virginia, with a note that just said, hold on to this. A few days after that, I drove the river road one more time, my own time, off duty. I told myself I just wanted to see it again before whatever was going to happen next happened. Right around dusk, at almost the exact same spot where I'd first seen him 3 months before, I saw him again. This time he wasn't walking. He was standing right at the edge of the river, on the Texas side, just standing there, facing across the water toward Mexico. Same khaki, same hat. Still as a fence post. I stopped the truck. I got out. I didn't call out this time. I just stood there, maybe 60 yards off, and he turned his head, slow, and looked at me. And I swear to you, there was nothing dramatic about it. No growl, no flash of teeth, nothing like that. Just a man looking at a woman across 60 yards of desert in the last orange light of the day. And then he turned, unhurried, and walked into the cane. And the cane didn't even rustle. My transfer orders came through the following Tuesday. Denali, Alaska. I accepted it. Not because they won. I want to be real clear about that. I accepted it because I'd already done the one thing none of the 31 rangers before me had done. The copies were already in the mail. Whatever happened to my report, whatever happened to that filing cabinet, whatever the regional office decided to do, there were 3 sets of that file sitting in places the park couldn't touch. A DA's office, a newsroom, my sister's house in Virginia. In 31 years, not one ranger had ever sent copies. I got one more phone call before I left Big Bend. It was Boyd Sutter, he said. June, I need to tell you something I didn't mention before. I told him to go ahead. I saw his photograph, Boyd said. Same as you did, the personnel file from 91. He paused, and I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, slow, like he was working up to something he'd carried a long time. But I also saw his date of birth. I asked him what it said. He was quiet for a second. Arthur Marsh was born in 1901, he said. I'm in Alaska now. Cold enough at night that I sleep just fine. But every so often, usually around dusk, when the light gets that long orange color, the same color it gets over the Chisos Mountains right before the sun drops behind them, I think about that alcove in Santa Elena Canyon. And I think about how many more spots like it there probably are, up and down 51 miles of river, that nobody's ever going to look for. Because the man digging those holes has had over 100 years of dusks to find them all. I was face down under a sheet of foil that felt like tin foil from my kitchen, except this one was supposed to save my life, and the ground underneath me was moving, not shaking. Not from the fire roaring 20 feet over my head like a freight train running through the canopy. This was slower than that. A push, then a pause, then another push. Like something underneath the dirt was breathing. I remember thinking, very clearly, in the middle of the loudest moment of my life, that's not possible. And then thinking, I need to remember this. Whatever happens, I need to remember this. So I did, and I'm going to tell you about it now because somebody should know, even if nobody official ever writes it down the way it actually happened. I'd been a Forest Service ranger for 31 years, mostly out of the Detroit Ranger District, over on the west side of the Cascades, Willamette National Forest. I retired in 2022. My wife Carol passed in 2024, pancreatic cancer, fast, 8 months from diagnosis to gone. After that, the house in Bend got real quiet, too quiet. So when the district called me that July and said they were short-staffed for fire season and asked if I'd take a volunteer lookout post for a few weeks, I said yes before they even finished the sentence. They sent me up to Bald Knob. It's a real lookout, decommissioned years back, but they still keep it weatherproofed for situations like this. 60-foot tower, catwalk around the outside, a little 15 by 15 cab on top with windows on all 4 sides. Inside there's an Osborne firefinder. That's a metal table with a map under glass, a sighting ring you spin around to get a bearing on smoke. There's a wood stove, a propane camp stove, a cot. The sleeping bag still smelled like the last guy who used it. Wood smoke and mouse droppings, and honestly I didn't mind. It felt like work, real work. I needed that. The job is simple. You glass the horizon every 30 minutes with binoculars. You take weather readings, temperature, relative humidity, wind speed and direction, off the instruments on the catwalk, and you call them in. If you see smoke, you take a bearing with the firefinder, estimate distance, and radio it to dispatch. That's it. Mostly it's just sitting there, watching, waiting, and hoping you don't see anything. That August we were seeing plenty. The Lion's Head 2 fire had been burning about 14 miles east of me for almost 2 weeks by the time I got up there. Big fire, tens of thousands of acres already, crews coming in from all over the country. Tess Fujimoto was running the show as incident commander. I knew her a little from before I retired. Sharp woman, the kind who wants numbers, not feelings. Tell me what you see, not what you think it means, she told me on my first radio check. Fair enough, that's the job anyway. Down the ridge from me, about 4 miles southeast, there was a hotshot crew cutting a fire line. Crew boss was a guy named Cal Briggs, big fella, gravel voice, the kind of guy who'd been doing this 20 years and looked it. I talked to him on the radio more than I talked to dispatch, honestly, because he liked to needle me about being retired and still out here playing lookout. You're supposed to be fishing, Mickelson, he said the first night. Fish don't talk back, I told him. Gets boring. He laughed at that. We got along. The forest that summer was about as dry as I'd ever seen it. Afternoon humidity was dropping into the single digits some days, and I want you to understand, single digits, that's almost desert numbers. In a temperate rainforest full of old-growth Douglas fir, everything was primed. The fire danger signs at the trailheads were all maxed out red. Every ranger in the district knew it was going to be a bad year. We just didn't know how bad, and we definitely didn't know what kind of bad. Day 3 on the tower, late afternoon, I saw smoke. It wasn't from the main fire. This was a new column, off by itself, bearing 247 degrees from my position, that's southwest, about 8 miles out. Near as I could tell. Thin gray-white, rising straight up with almost no wind drift, which was strange in itself because we'd had a steady breeze out of the northeast all day. I logged it, took my bearing twice to be sure, and called it in to Tess. Bald Knob dispatch, copy your smoke report. Bearing 247, distance approximately 8 miles. Will advise air resources. Copy, I said. I kept glassing it for the next 20 minutes or so while I did my other readings. It didn't grow, but it didn't shrink either. Just sat there, this thin column, like a candle burning in the distance. Then I did my full instrument round on the catwalk. Takes about 10 minutes. You're walking around checking the anemometer, the hygrothermometer, writing numbers down, and when I came back inside and picked the binoculars back up to check on it again, it was gone, not faded, not thinned out. Gone. No haze where it had been, no glow, nothing. I scanned the whole horizon in that area for another 15 minutes, thinking maybe I'd lost bearing, but no. I could still pick out the same ridgeline, the same notch in the trees I'd used as my reference point. The smoke had just stopped existing. I radioed it in as a probable false alarm. Bald knob, dispatch, disregard previous smoke report bearing 247. Column has dissipated, likely dust or slash haze. Copy that, bald knob. Dust devils happen. Slash piles smolder and then quit. I told myself that, wrote it in the log, and moved on with my evening readings. That's the job. You see 100 things a season that turn out to be nothing. But that night, I couldn't sleep right, and I got to flipping through the old lookout logbooks they keep up there. Bald Knob's been staffed off and on for decades, and there's a shelf of these old composition books going back to the 70s. I was just killing time, honestly. And I found an entry from 19 years back, August again, different lookout. Guy named Gareth Paulson, his entry was short, smoke sighted, bearing 247, distance approximately 8 miles. Column dissipated within 30 minutes, marked as false alarm, same bearing, same distance, same description, almost word for word. I sat there for a minute with that book open on my lap, and I told myself, okay, that's not that strange. 247 southwest from this tower probably points at the same drainage every time, and slash piles or hot spots in that drainage probably do the same thing every time. Coincidence? Sure, but explainable coincidence. Then I remembered why I knew Gareth Paulson's name at all. I'd processed his accident report. He drove his truck off the access road the morning after that logbook entry, lost control on a switchback about 6 miles down from the tower, went through the guardrail, rolled about 200 feet down the slope. Single vehicle. No other cars on the road. They figured he fell asleep at the wheel. End of a long shift. Easy mistake to make on those roads. I closed the book and put it back on the shelf, and I remember telling myself, out loud, in an empty cabin 60 feet up a tower in the middle of a national forest, it's just a coincidence, Dale. And I believed it, mostly. I didn't sleep great that night anyway. The next several days, the focus shifted hard onto the main fire, and that's when things really started to feel wrong. Not spooky wrong yet, just wrong in a way that made the professionals around me start to sound rattled, and that's a sound I'd never heard from Tess before. Lion's Head 2 had been burning in a fairly normal pattern, pushing northeast with the prevailing wind, which is what you'd expect. Then on day 5, it jumped Highway 22. For those who don't know the area, Highway 22 up there is a paved 2-lane road cutting through the forest, and it's one of the better containment lines you can ask for. No fuel on the road itself, decent width. Crews had already done burnout operations along sections of it to widen the buffer. It should hold a fire like that, especially with the wind blowing the way it was. It jumped it anyway, at the narrowest point of the whole road, where the buffer was thinnest, almost like it picked the weak spot. And here's the part that got everybody's attention. The wind that whole day was blowing northeast, steady, 12 to 15 miles an hour, confirmed by every weather station in the area, including mine. The fire crossed the highway moving northwest, against the wind. I heard Tess on the radio that evening, talking to the air attack supervisor, and her voice had this edge to it I'd never heard before. I need someone to explain to me how we have spot fires a half-mile upwind of the head, she said. That's not how this works. Nobody had a good answer. The working theory was some kind of localized wind shift, a thermal eddy off the terrain, something like that. Possible. Cascades terrain does weird things to wind sometimes. Everybody who's worked fire up there knows that. But Tess didn't sound like someone who just accepted a normal explanation. She sounded like someone filing it away. After that, I started keeping a second log, not the official one, my own, in a spare notebook I had in my pack. Every time I got a fire perimeter update from dispatch, I'd plot it on my topo map with a pencil. Just for my own curiosity, really. I had nothing but time up there. After about 4 days of plotting, I started seeing something that didn't sit right with me. A normal fire spreads kind of like spilled water, roughly oval, stretched out in the direction of the wind, with the long axis pointing downwind. Lion's Head 2 wasn't doing that. It was branching, sending out these long, narrow fingers in different directions, almost like the roots of a tree, or the veins on the back of your hand. Branches splitting off from branches, and every single one of those fingers, everyone, stopped at the same elevation, 4,200 feet. I checked it against the contour lines on my topo map probably a dozen times, because I didn't believe it the first few times. Didn't matter what direction the finger ran, didn't matter what the slope or the fuel type was. 4,200 feet, and it stopped or turned, or did something else, but it didn't cross that line. In 31 years, I had never seen a fire behave like that. Fire doesn't care about elevation in some neat, clean way like that. Fire cares about fuel, wind, slope, moisture, not a number on a map. I didn't say anything about this to Tess. What was I going to say? The fire's drawing a shape on the mountain, and it looks deliberate. She'd have pulled me off that tower for a psych eval. So I just kept my pencil lines to myself and kept doing my job. A couple days after that, Cal's crew found something while cutting a new fire line lower on the ridge. He radioed me about it that evening, and I could tell from his voice this wasn't his usual griping. "Mickelson, you still up there?" "Where else would I be, Cal? We hit something weird cutting line today. Crew got down through the duff to mineral soil. You know, normal stuff. Scrape it down to bare dirt, and underneath there's this layer. White, chalky looking. Like somebody dumped a truckload of drywall powder down there, and it baked solid. Could be old ash, mineral deposits. That kind of thing happens sometimes," I said. "Yeah, I thought that too. Except it was hot, Dale. Hot before the fire ever got near it. Jenny, one of my sawyers, she put her glove on it to brush it back and burned right through. 2nd degree on 2 fingers. We had to medevac her out." "How hot's hot?" "Hot enough to do that through a leather glove in about 10 seconds. And it's not just one spot. We've hit it 3 more times today, different parts of the line. Same white stuff, same heat. Ground that the fire hasn't even touched yet, and it's already cooking from underneath." I didn't have an answer for him. I told him to flag the locations and keep his crew away from it. And he said that part wasn't a problem. Nobody wanted to go near it twice. That night, I got on the satellite phone and called a guy I'd known for years, Rick Olmsted. Rick was a Uskis volcanologist, retired now, living down in Corvallis. We'd worked together a couple times over the years on geothermal hazard stuff. There's some old volcanic vents and hot springs scattered through the Cascades, and occasionally the Forest Service and Uskis have to coordinate on that. I described what Cal's crew had found. White, chalky, hard, hot from below, not from the fire. Rick was quiet on the line for a good few seconds, longer than felt normal. "Dale, where exactly is this?" I gave him the rough location, the elevation, right around that same 4,200-foot band. Of course, that sounds like it could be a calcium carbonate deposit, travertine, or something close to it. The kind of thing you get from hydrothermal venting, hot mineral water coming up through rock, leaving deposits behind as it cools and evaporates. Like at Yellowstone, the terraces there. Okay, so there's a hot spring under there somewhere. "Dale, there's no known hydrothermal feature anywhere in that part of the forest. Nothing on any survey, nothing in the literature, nothing. I'd know. That's not a corner of the Cascades that gets ignored. People have mapped the hell out of that geology for 50 years. Well, something's making the ground hot, Rick." Another pause. "To form a deposit like you're describing. Solid, that thick, that consistent, you need sustained heat. Not a one-time event. Sustained. We're talking temperatures over 300 degrees Fahrenheit, applied from below, more or less continuously, for a long time." "How long is a long time?" "Centuries, Dale. Possibly a lot longer than that." I didn't really know what to say to that, and apparently neither did he, because we both just sat there on the line for a bit. Eventually, he said he'd make some calls, see if anyone in his old department had heard anything, and that he'd get back to me. He sounded different by the end of that call than he had at the start. Less like a scientist who'd been handed a puzzle, and more like a guy who just remembered something he didn't want to remember. He never did call me back. I found out why later, but I'm getting ahead of myself. 3 days after that call, the fire did something that, even now, I have trouble saying out loud without it sounding made up. It crossed the ridge behind my tower. Up to that point, my situation had been fine. The active fire was east of me. The crews were working a line south and east of that, and I had a clear evacuation route. A trail heading south off the ridge that eventually connected to a forest road. 11 miles total to the nearest road by trail, which sounds like a lot, but on a calm day, it's just a long hike. Not an emergency. That afternoon, smoke conditions got bad. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. That thick gray-brown soup that smoke events bring, where you can't even see the trees 100 yards off the tower. I was doing my readings half by feel, and around 4 in the afternoon, Tess came over the radio, and her voice had gone from professional concern to something closer to, "I need you to listen very carefully right now. Bald Knob, be advised we have fire activity reported on the ridge to your immediate west. Repeat, west of your position. Can you confirm visual?" I couldn't confirm anything. Visibility was 0. But about 10 minutes later, the smoke shifted just enough, and through a gap I saw it, a glow. Orange, low on the ridge line less than a mile west of the tower. The fire that had been burning 14 miles east of me 3 days earlier was now on the ridge behind me. I want to be clear about what that meant geographically, because it matters. That fire had to cross terrain, cross drainages, cross areas that should have slowed it down enormously, and it had to do it fast enough that nobody, Not air attack, not the satellite mapping, not Cal's crew on the ground. Saw it coming until it was basically on top of my position. Fire doesn't teleport. But however it got there, it was there, and now I had active fire to my east and active fire to my west. Tess ordered an immediate evacuation. Bald Knob, you need to move now. South Trail, do not delay. Copy, evacuating now, I said, and I meant it. I started packing, grabbed my pack, my water, my radio, started shutting down the propane. And then, almost out of habit, because I'd done it probably 200 times over the past week, I sat down at the firefinder one more time to take a bearing on that western glow. Standard procedure, you note the location of any new fire activity before you bug out, in case it's useful to the crews. I looked through the sighting slit out toward the burn scar that the fire had already passed through to the east. The area that should have been nothing but black ash and smoke by then, completely dead, nothing left to burn. And there was a light coming from it, not fire-colored. Fire is orange, yellow, sometimes red through smoke. This was pale, almost white, almost blue-white, like the glow off a fish tank, or one of those electric bug zappers. Steady, not flickering like flame does. It was spread out low along the ground in the burn scar, not in one spot but in a long, irregular line. And I could only see it at all because the smoke had gotten thick enough to block the moon and stars. So the whole world was pitch black except for that. I sat there with my pack half on my shoulder, looking at that light for probably a full minute, maybe two. Long enough that Tess came back on the radio asking for a status update, and I had to key the mic and say, "Copy, en route," even though I hadn't moved. I want to be honest with you. I knew what the smart thing to do was. The smart thing was to go down that south trail, get to the road, get in a truck, and let the professionals sort out whatever that light was from a safe distance with proper equipment after the fact. But I'd spent 4 days plotting a fire that drew a shape on a mountain. I'd talked to a man who told me the ground had been cooking from below for centuries, and now I was looking at a light coming out of burned ground that had no business glowing at all. I went the other way. I'm not going to pretend that decision makes sense on paper, because it doesn't. But I'd been a ranger most of my life because I liked knowing what was actually happening, not what the report said was happening. And right then, more than I was scared, and I was scared, I needed to know. I went down the tower, and instead of taking the south trail, I cut east into the fresh burn scar toward that light. About 2 miles, by my reckoning, though distance gets strange in smoke and dark like that. The ground changed under my boots before I even got close to the glow. In a normal burn area, you're walking on ash, soft, gray. It puffs up around your boots, sometimes still warm, but it gives under your weight. This wasn't that, this crunched. Hard, brittle, walking on broken glass or eggshells. Except it didn't break into pieces, it just crunched and held. My headlamp showed me a ground surface that looked fused. Shiny in patches, almost like a crust of dark glass had formed over the soil. And sticking up out of that fused ground, here and there, were these tubes. That's the only word I've got for them. Where tree roots had burned. And on a normal fire, a root burns out and leaves a hollow channel in the dirt. That's completely normal. We call those root holes. These had left behind tubes of what looked like dark glass, following the exact path the roots had taken. Branching the way roots branch, going down into the ground at all angles. I got down on my knees next to one of the bigger ones, maybe 8 inches across at the opening, and shined my headlamp down it. The light just went. I couldn't see the bottom. The beam disappeared into the dark like the tube just kept going, and there was air moving. Coming up out of that tube, slow and steady like a person breathing out. Warm air. Not fire hot, but warm, like standing near a heating vent. And it had a smell to it. Not wood smoke, which by that point I'd been breathing for 2 weeks straight and would know anywhere. This was different. Mineral. A little sulfur to it, like a hot spring smell, but underneath that, something else. Something old. I don't have a better word than that. It smelled old, the way an old basement or an old cave smells, except amplified. Like it had been sealed up for a very long time and was only just now getting out. I was still kneeling there, looking down that tube, when I heard headlamps and voices coming through the smoke behind me, and Cal Briggs's voice, loud and furious, calling my name. Cal's crew had gotten word I'd gone off-trail into the burn scar instead of evacuating, and Cal, bless him, had brought 6 of his guys in after me, against every protocol in the book, because that's the kind of man he is. He was not happy. "Mickelson, are you out of your goddamn mind? We've got fire on 3 sides, and you're out here on your knees playing with the dirt?" "Cal, look at this," I said, and I think something in my voice stopped him, because he came over, and a couple of his crew came with him, headlamps sweeping the ground, and one of those lights landed on the glow. It was further down the slope from where I was, that same pale light, coming up out of more of these glass tubes in a rough line. And for the first time, with more light on the scene and more people seeing it, I watched grown men, experienced wildland firefighters, guys who'd seen things on fire lines that would turn your stomach, go quiet in a way I recognized. The quiet of people seeing something they don't have a box to put it in. That's when one of the younger guys, kid named Pete Ochoa, took a step back, away from the glow, which made sense. Everybody was backing away from it, and put his foot down on a section of that fused crust, about 10 feet off to the side. It went through like a sheet of ice over a pond. Pete dropped, just gone, down to about his chest, and then his footing gave entirely, and he went the rest of the way, 6 feet down into a cavity that opened up under that crust like it had been, waiting there. Cal had him by the wrist almost before he finished falling, and between Cal and 2 other guys, they hauled him back up in maybe 10 seconds, but 10 seconds was enough. Pete wasn't hurt, scraped up, shaken, but nothing broken. What had him shaking wasn't the fall. It was what he'd seen on the way down. He kept saying it was a cave, a space under the ground, bigger than the hole he'd fallen through. He said his light had caught walls going off in both directions, smooth walls, like they'd been worked, not just natural rock. And he said the walls were warm, not hot like the glass tubes. Warm, he said, like skin, like body temperature. And he said there were marks on the walls, scratches. He was very specific about that word, not carvings, not writing. Scratches, like something had dragged its fingers or claws down the rock, over and over, in long parallel lines. But the scratches weren't fresh. They were part of the rock now, calcified into it, the same way the white deposits Cal's crew had found earlier were calcified. Whatever made those marks had made them a very long time ago, and the rock had grown over them since, and somehow you could still see them. Nobody had time to process that, because that's when the canopy lit up over our heads. I won't pretend I remember the exact sequence of the next few minutes in perfect order, because nobody does in a situation like that. What I remember is Cal's voice flat and fast, doing exactly what a good crew boss does. Shelters now, everybody down, find your spot, deploy. Deploy, and the sound. The sound is the thing people who haven't been through a burnover can't really understand. It's not like a campfire. It's a roar, deep, with a kind of shriek inside it from the air itself moving, and it gets louder so fast that your body starts reacting before your brain catches up. We deployed shelters right there on that crunching glass ground. 8 of us, face down, shelter pulled tight around us, breathing through the gap at the bottom near the dirt the way you're trained to, because the air right at ground level is the coolest air there is in a burnover. And coolest is relative. It's still hot enough to hurt. The fire went over us. I felt the heat through the shelter, through my clothes, on my back and the backs of my legs. That specific kind of heat that you feel in your teeth almost. The roar was so loud I couldn't hear anything else. Not Cal, not the crew, nothing. And underneath all of that, underneath the noise and the heat, I felt the ground. It was pulsing. I want to be careful with that word because I know how it sounds. It wasn't shaking from the fire, or from us, or from anything moving on the surface. It was a slow push up against my chest and stomach where I was pressed flat against that fused ground, and then a pause, and then another push. Steady, even. The way your own heartbeat is steady, and even when you're lying very still and paying attention to it. It went on the entire time the fire passed over us. I don't know how long that was. It always feels longer than it is. Everybody says that, and they're right. Maybe 2 minutes, maybe 3. Long enough for me to feel that pulse a dozen times or more, lying there with my face 6 inches from dirt that I had, less than 10 minutes earlier, watched glow with a light that wasn't fire. And then it passed. The roar dropped to a lower roar, then to crackling, then to the ordinary sound of a forest fire burning the way forest fires normally sound, somewhere off and moving away from us. Cal's voice came back, hoarse, calling out names. Everybody answered. Nobody was hurt, burned a little around the edges of our gear. Eyebrows singed on a couple of the guys, but nobody hurt. We got up and we looked around. And for the first time since I'd arrived at that tower 3 weeks earlier, I could actually see the mountain. I mean that literally. The canopy was gone. Every tree around us for as far as I could see in the dark. And with the fire moved off, and the smoke thinning for the first time in days, I could see a long way. Every tree was either down or standing dead and stripped bare. The whole slope was just open ground and standing snags, all the way down to where the terrain leveled off below us. And on that open ground, you could see the shape of the mountain itself in a way you never can when it's covered in forest. There was a line, a long, shallow depression, running along the contour of the slope, curving away in both directions until it disappeared around the mountain. And I knew, without even getting my map out, exactly what elevation that line was at, because I'd been staring at that number on a topo map for over a week. 200 feet. The same line every branch of that fire had stopped at, or turned along, for 10 days. Except now I wasn't looking at it on a map. I was looking at it on the actual ground, and it wasn't subtle. It looked like a scar. Like something enormous had been buried there once. A long time ago, and the ground had healed over it but never quite flattened back out. The way a bad cut never quite disappears even after it heals. And along that line, not just where Pete had fallen through, but all along it, as far as I could see in either direction, there were more of those glass tubes, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all of them venting that same warm, mineral-smelling air into the night, all of them glowing faintly with that same pale light, now that there was nothing left to hide them. Cal came and stood next to me, and he didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Quiet," in a completely different voice than the one he'd used to order the shelter deployment. "Mickelson, what in the hell is that?" I didn't have an answer for him. I still don't, not really. But I told him what I did know, the elevation line, the pattern in the fire's spread, the calcium deposits, what Rick had told me about sustained heat over centuries. I told him about Gareth Paulson's logbook entry, 19 years and one bearing apart from mine. Cal listened to all of it without interrupting, which for Cal was its own kind of remarkable. When I finished, he just looked back out at that line on the mountain, at all those glowing tubes, and he said, "We need to get off this hill." We did. All 8 of us walked out together, south, off that ridge, and it took us most of the rest of the night, and nobody talked much. The official record says the Lion's Head 2 fire was contained at 23,400 acres about a week later. There's an incident report. There's a final perimeter map. The erratic spread is attributed, in the report, to extreme fire behavior associated with terrain-driven wind anomalies during a record drought year, which is a sentence that means almost nothing. And I think whoever wrote it knew that, but it's the kind of sentence that closes a file. There's a line in there, too, about anomalous mineral deposits and subsurface thermal readings in the burn area, noted as referred to as GEs for further geological assessment. I know that's true, because I'm the one who flagged it. I never heard back about that assessment. I tried calling Rick Olmsted twice more after that night. The first time, his wife answered and said he wasn't taking calls, he wasn't feeling well. The second time, about a month later, the number had been disconnected. 3 weeks after the burnover, once the area had cooled enough and the closure orders had lifted for everything except the immediate burn scar, I drove back up there, told myself I was checking on the tower, which was true. It needed to be secured for the winter anyway. But I walked down to that line, that scar along the 4,200-foot contour, because I needed to see it again with my own eyes in daylight, without smoke, without fire, just to know I hadn't imagined it. The white deposits were gone, scraped away. It looked like there were marks in the ground, consistent with heavy equipment, tracks, the kind of thing you'd see after an excavator had been through. The glass tubes, all the ones I could find, and I looked for a long time, had been filled, poured full of concrete, everyone, flush with the ground, like someone had gone down that entire line and capped every single vent. And at intervals along the line there were signs. New ones, metal posts freshly set in concrete footings, the kind of sign you'd expect to see at a hazardous site. They read, "Hazardous terrain, geological instability. Do not enter." I've put up Forest Service signs for 31 years. I know what they look like. I know the fonts we use. I know the regulation citation format that goes in small print at the bottom of every official sign. It's a specific code, references a specific section of the federal regulations, and every ranger who's ever ordered signage from the regional office has that format memorized whether they want to or not. The font on these signs was close, but not right, and the regulation number at the bottom didn't correspond to anything. I looked it up when I got home. It doesn't exist. Not a typo of a real one. Just doesn't exist in any agency's code, federal or state. Somebody had gone in there in the 3 weeks since the fire, with heavy equipment and concrete and professionally printed signage, and sealed that whole line back up. And it wasn't us. There's one more thing. Before I left the district for good that fall, I went back through the old records one more time, and I found Gareth Paulson's full incident file, the one I'd processed 19 years earlier, the one I'd more or less forgotten the details of, until that smoke report on Bearing 247 brought his name back to me. Most of the file is what you'd expect. Accident report, vehicle inspection, the usual. But there's an evidence inventory list. Items recovered from his truck after it went off the road, and on that list, item number 11 is his personal logbook, separate from the official lookout log, his own notes, the same kind of notebook I'd been keeping that whole summer without thinking about why. The file says the logbook was reviewed and found not relevant to the investigation and returned to his next of kin. But somebody at some point had photocopied the last page before it went back, and that photocopy was still in the file, behind the inventory sheet, like it had been filed there and forgotten. His handwriting was rougher than mine, and the entry wasn't dated the night of the smoke sighting. It was dated the morning after, the same morning he died, like it was the last thing he wrote before he got in his truck. It said, "The fire is not the danger. The fire is the warning. Something below is waking up, and the forest was keeping it asleep." I don't know what Gareth Paulson saw in the 19 years before me. I don't know what he was driving toward or away from on that road that morning, or whether the accident was an accident at all. I don't know who poured concrete down those tubes, or who printed those signs, or how they knew to be there within 3 weeks of the fire, in country that takes 11 miles of switchbacks just to reach. What I do know is that the line is still there, under the concrete, under whatever's grown back over it by now, and somewhere along 11 miles of trail, on a ridge in the Cascades that's now mostly standing dead timber, there's a long, shallow scar at exactly 4,200 feet, and I have felt, with my own body, pressed flat against the ground while fire passed over me, something underneath that line, breathing. I never went back up to Bald Knob after that fall. They asked me the next summer if I wanted the post again, and I told them my knees couldn't take the stairs anymore. That wasn't really it. The truth is, I think about that pulse more nights than I'd like to admit, and some part of me has never quite stopped wondering whether it noticed me too. Whether, somewhere under that mountain, something that's been asleep a very, very long time, knows that for a few minutes one August night, somebody was lying right there on top of it, listening. The first time I knew something was wrong with Ichtucknee Springs, a grown man came up out of that blue hole and couldn't make a sound. I was on the boardwalk doing my normal walk-through, mid-morning, middle of the week, nothing going on. Then I heard splashing that didn't sound right. Not the happy kind you hear from tube floaters all summer. This was fast and ragged, like someone was fighting the water. I looked over the rail and saw a diver clawing his way to the bank, mask half off, gear half off, like he couldn't get out of that spring fast enough. He crawled up on the sand and threw up. Then he just sat there, soaking wet, staring at nothing. I asked him if he was hurt. He didn't answer. I asked again. Nothing. It took almost 20 minutes before he said a single word, and when he finally did, all he said was, "I'm done. I'm done diving, forever." He packed his truck that same afternoon and left. Never came back for his deposit. Never came back for the tank he still owed rental money on. Just gone. That was the first thing. It wasn't the last, and looking back, it wasn't even close to the worst. I should probably back up and tell you how I ended up at that park in the first place, because it matters for what comes later. I'd spent 11 years as a Navy diver before I got out. Ship hull inspections, salvage work, that kind of thing. After the Navy, I took a ranger job at Gulf Islands National Seashore over in Mississippi, married a shrimper named Tommy out of Biloxi, and figured that was going to be my life. It wasn't. The marriage fell apart after about 6 years, and the last real conversation Tommy and I had, he told me I loved the ocean more than I loved him. He wasn't wrong, and I think that's what made it hurt so much, hearing it said out loud like that. So when a transfer came open at Ichtucknee Springs State Park in north central Florida, I took it. I wanted something easy, something boring. A park full of families on inner tubes, sunburned college kids, the occasional drunk guy who needed to be told to put his shirt back on. Florida Springs are about as far from the open ocean as you can get and still be in the water. Shallow, warm, clear as glass. That's what I told myself I was getting into. For the most part, that's exactly what it was. Ichtucknee is what they call a first magnitude spring system, meaning it's one of the biggest in the world. The main spring alone puts out something like 233 million gallons of water a day. All of it coming up out of the ground from an aquifer that stretches for miles underneath the limestone. That water feeds a spring run about 6 miles long, which empties into the Santa Fe River. In the summer, the park is packed. Tubes end to end. Kids screaming. Music playing from somebody's cooler speaker, even though it's against the rules. The head spring itself, the main spring, the one everybody floats from, sits at the bottom of a wooden boardwalk loop. You can stand up there and look straight down through 25 feet of water and count individual grains of sand on the bottom. That's not an exaggeration. The water is that clear. People always say it looks fake, like a swimming pool, like somebody dyed it that color on purpose. What most of the tourists don't think about, what most of them never even notice, is the cave system underneath all of it. Florida sits on top of limestone, and limestone dissolves over time, and that leaves behind caves. Under Ichtucknee, those caves are flooded, and they go on for miles. I'm talking about a maze of underwater passages stretching at least 3 miles out from the main spring, with some chambers going down past 180 feet. Cave divers consider it one of the most dangerous diving environments on the planet. Not because of anything that lives down there, but because of the cave itself. No light, no surface to swim to if something goes wrong. Passages that look exactly the same in every direction. People get lost down there and they don't come back. It's happened before, more than once, all over the state. That's why every single spring vent in that park has a sign on it. Bright colors, big letters. Underwater cave, open water divers stop here. You don't go past that sign unless you're cave certified, and even then, you'd better know what you're doing. I want to be clear about something. For my first 3 months at that park, none of that mattered to me beyond doing my job. I checked the signs were in place. I made sure tourists weren't trying to free dive past the cavern line on a dare. I wrote up the occasional citation. It was easy work, and I was grateful for easy. Then that diver came up the way I told you, and that was the first crack in it. His name was on the dive shop log. I won't use it, because he asked me not to put it in my report, and even though I did anyway, I think the least I can do now is leave it out. He was certified for advanced cave diving, over 200 log dives, a guy who clearly knew what he was doing. He wasn't some tourist who wandered past a sign. After he calmed down enough to talk, here's what he told me, and I wrote most of it down word for word because something about the way he said it made me want to get it exactly right. He said he'd been following a passage off the main tunnel that he'd never explored before, not on any of the maps he had, which for cave divers is a big deal because those maps get updated constantly and people are obsessive about them. He followed it back maybe 200 feet, and then the water changed. Those were his words. The water changed. I asked him what he meant by that, and he had trouble explaining it. He said it wasn't cloudy. It wasn't silty, like when you kick up sediment off the bottom. He said it got thick, like swimming through syrup, he said, except it didn't slow him down the way syrup would. It was more like the water was pushing back against him, just a little, in a way that didn't make sense. He said his dive computer started doing something strange with the temperature. Florida spring water is famous for being a constant 72 degrees, year-round, no matter what's going on up on the surface. It's that part of what makes it safe. Divers don't have to worry about thermoclines like you do in open water. But his computer showed the temperature dropping. Then it came back up. Then it dropped again. He said it kept doing that, over and over, like clockwork, and it was happening too fast to be anything natural. He said that's when he decided to turn around. And right as he was turning, his light passed across the floor of the chamber, and he saw something down there. I asked him what it was. He looked at me for a second, and then he looked away, out toward the spring run, and he said, "I'd rather not say. That was it. That's all I got." He wouldn't elaborate. Not for me, not for the EMTs, not for the dive shop owner who came out to ask if he was okay. I wrote up an incident report that afternoon. Diver in distress, possible panic attack or equipment malfunction, no injuries. Subject declined further evaluation. And I filed it the way you file everything, and it went into a drawer, and as far as I know, nobody ever looked at it again. I want to tell you something else now, something I didn't put in that report, or any report, ever, until much later. About 6 weeks before that diver came up screaming without sound, something happened to me. It wasn't much. At the time, I told myself it was nothing. Part of my job included routine maintenance checks on the safety lines and markers in what's called the cavern zone. That's the area just past the head spring where there's still some daylight reaching down before the true cave starts and it goes pitch black. It's considered low risk. Lots of rangers and dive shop staff go down there with just a single tank to check anchor points, replace worn line, that kind of thing. I'd done it a dozen times by then. That day, one of the permanent line anchors had come loose from its bolt, and I went down to reset it. I was maybe 60 feet down, right at the edge where the cavern zone starts to darken into the cave proper. I had my light on the bolt, working on it, and out of habit I swept the light off to the side, the way you do, just checking my surroundings. And for about half a second, my light caught something. It was deeper in, past where the cavern darkens out, right at the edge of where my beam could still reach. And it was vertical, like something standing, except nothing stands underwater. Things float, they drift, they tilt with the current. This was straight up and down, just hanging there in the water, not moving at all. And there were two pale spots on it, up near the top, and when my light hit them, they didn't flash the way an animal's eyes do. You know how if you shine a light at a gator or a fish at night, you get that quick bright flash and then the eyes move, the animal reacts. These didn't do that. They just reflected the light back, steady, like a couple of pale stones, and they didn't move at all. I finished the bolt faster than I needed to, and I went up. On the surface, I told myself it was a big gar. We do get them in there sometimes, and they can get pretty large, 3 or 4 feet, with that long snout and those rows of teeth. I told myself the light had caught its eyes wrong, at a weird angle, and that's why it looked the way it did. I didn't write it up. I didn't tell my supervisor. I just made a quiet decision, the kind you don't even really decide on purpose, to never go past the cavern marker again unless I absolutely had to. For 7 months, I kept that decision, and I didn't think about it much, and life at Ichtuckney went back to being exactly what I'd hoped it would be. Tubers, sunburns, the occasional citation for glass bottles, which aren't allowed in the park. I almost forgot about the gar, or whatever it was. Almost. There was an old man named Hutto who ran a canoe and kayak rental place just outside the park boundary, on the Santa Fe side. He'd been doing it for something like 50 years, since before the state even bought the land for the park. I used to stop by his place on my days off, mostly because he made decent coffee and he liked to talk, and I liked to listen. One afternoon, I mentioned the diver who'd come up sick, just making conversation, not thinking much of it. Hutto got quiet for a second, and then he said something I still think about. He said, "Spring's been doing that since I was a boy. Every few years, somebody comes up wrong. Most of them just leave and don't come back, same as that fella you're talking about. Every once in a while, somebody don't come up at all." I asked him what he meant by wrong. He shrugged, the way old men do when they've decided they've said enough. Just wrong. You'll know it if you ever see it. I asked him if there were old stories about the spring, folklore, anything like that. He said his grandfather used to say the spring had a heartbeat, way down deep, below where any diver could get to. Said the old families who lived along the river before the park was a park used to say you didn't dive past the blue light at the bottom, because the spring kept what it needed and gave back what it didn't. I asked him what that meant, kept what it needed. He just poured me more coffee and changed the subject to bass fishing, and that was the end of it. I drove home thinking it was just an old man's story, the kind every small town has about every body of water near it. I'd grown up near the Gulf, and we had our own stories. Ghost ships, drowned sailors, lights out on the water at night. Every place that's got water's got stories like that. I didn't think about Hutto's again for a long time. 7 months after that first diver came up sick, everything changed. And it changed because of a routine water quality survey. The Florida Geological Survey sends teams out periodically to check spring systems, water clarity, flow rate, nitrate levels, that kind of thing. It's not exciting work, mostly. A team of 3 came out to Ichtuckney that week, and as part of their assessment, they wanted to send a remote camera, basically a small underwater drone on a tether, into the main cave passage to document conditions at depth. This wasn't unusual. They'd done it before at other springs. I was on duty that day, mostly just there to keep tourists from wandering too close while the team worked. I remember it was a Thursday, slow overcast, not many people in the park. The drone went in through the head spring and followed the main passage down. The team had a monitor set up on the dock, and I wasn't paying close attention. I was watching the parking lot, honestly, until I heard one of them say, wait, go back." I walked over. On the screen, the passage looked the way it always does in those videos. White limestone walls, clear water, the camera's lights cutting 2 narrow beams through the dark. The drone had drifted into a side passage, off to the right. One of the team members said wasn't on any of their maps. At a depth reading of 147 feet, the camera turned, and for about 11 seconds, before the feed cut to static, it showed something hanging in the water ahead of it. A person, upright, arms straight down at their sides, the way you'd stand at attention, except they were just floating there, dead center in the passage, not touching the floor or the ceiling. The gear was old. I could see that even on the small monitor, a bulky yellow vest-style BC, the kind that went out of style decades ago, and a regulator with a logo I recognized because my dad used to dive with the same brand back in the 70s and 80s. The mask was clear, and through it, I could see the person's eyes. They were open. The feed cut to static right after that, 11 seconds total, and the drone never reconnected. They lost the unit completely. When they reeled in the tether, the camera housing came back up empty, just a cable with nothing on the end of it, like it had been unscrewed. The team leader called it in to the county. I called it in too, separately, because that's protocol. Any indication of a body in the park, even an old one, even a possible one, has to go through both the county and the state. That's how Walt Drucker came into it. Walt was the county's dive recovery specialist, had been for about 30 years. He showed up the next morning in a truck that was older than some of the tourists in the park, walking with the kind of limp that told you his knees had given out on him a long time ago, and he'd just decided to keep going anyway. He was maybe 62, gray crew cut, the kind of face that's permanently a little sunburned. He watched the 11 seconds of footage 4 times without saying anything. Then he said, "Yellow Daker BC, round gauge, not digital. That's not current gear. That's 80s gear." I asked him if he could tell who it might be. He didn't answer right away. He pulled a laptop out of his truck, the screen cracked in one corner, and started going through old case files. Florida keeps records on every diver who's ever gone missing in a cave system in the state, because unfortunately there have been enough of them that they need a database. He cross-referenced the gear description, the depth, the location. After about 20 minutes, he turned the laptop around so I could see it. The file was dated November 14, 1987. A diver named Brian Kessler, 26 years old at the time, had entered the Itukni cave system that day and never come back out. His car, a tan Datsun, was found in the parking lot the next morning, still locked, with his wallet and a change of clothes inside. His dive gear was never recovered. Search teams went in for almost 2 weeks before they called it off. The case was officially closed in 1990, ruled a presumed drowning. Body never recovered. Walt looked at the footage again, then at the file photo of Kessler. A young guy, dark hair, grinning at the camera in front of a dive shop somewhere, and then back at the footage. Same gear, he said. Same depth range. Same general area he was last seen heading into. He rubbed his jaw. 39 years he's been down there. And that gear looks like it came out of a box yesterday. I asked him what that meant. He said, "Means cold. Still water can keep things in pretty good shape longer than people think. Bodies too, sometimes. Depends on the chemistry." I've pulled divers out of caves who'd been down 20-25 years, and they didn't look like much of anything you'd want to see, but the gear was still recognizable. He closed the laptop. 39's a long time, though. Longest I've ever dealt with. Could be we get down there, and there's nothing left but gear and bone. Wouldn't be the worst thing I've seen. He said it so plainly, like he was talking about picking up trash on the side of the road. I found out later that's just how Walt talked about it. 30 years of pulling drowned people out of underwater caves does something to a person's bedside manner, and Walt's had worn down to almost nothing. He wasn't cruel. He was just tired, in a way that had settled all the way into his bones. He looked at me and said, "You're cave certified." I told him I'd done cave training in the Navy, years back, and I'd kept current on it, mostly out of habit. He nodded like that settled something. I usually work solo or with another county diver, but my regular partner's out with a torn rotator cuff, and this passage isn't on any map we've got. I'd rather have a second set of eyes than go in blind by myself. "You up for it?" I said yes before I'd really thought it through. Looking back, I think part of me said yes because of that thing I saw 7 months earlier, the vertical shape with the pale spots that didn't move. I never told Walt about that. I'm not sure why. I think some part of me wanted to go down there and prove to myself it had just been a gar. We spent the next day on planning, and I want to walk through that a little, because it matters. Cave diving isn't something you just show up and do. Walt laid out the dive plan on the hood of his truck. We'd be using a continuous guideline the whole way, tied off at the cavern entrance and run all the way to wherever we ended up, so we'd always have a physical line back to the surface, even with zero visibility. We each carried primary and backup lights, 3 lights minimum. That's the rule, because losing your light in a cave with no natural light source at all isn't an inconvenience. It's a life-threatening emergency. We planned our gas using the rule of thirds. A third of our air to go in, a third to come out, and a third held in reserve for problems. We agreed on hand signals and slate communication, since voice doesn't work underwater outside of full-face masks with comms, which we didn't have. Walt didn't sugarcoat the recovery itself. He told me what to expect from a body that had been in the water a long time: discoloration, tissue loss, the possibility that the remains might come apart during the lift, and we'd need to bag what we could. He told me this in the same flat voice he'd used for everything else, and I appreciated it, honestly. I'd rather know what I was walking into. We went in the next morning. The main passage was exactly like the footage, exactly like every description I'd ever heard from cave divers. White limestone walls, water so clear it barely felt like water at all. Our lights cutting 2 clean tunnels through the dark ahead of us. Walt led, running the line. I followed about 10 feet back, watching our depth and our gas the way I'd been trained. The passage narrowed and widened a few times as we went, the way limestone caves do. Sometimes we had room to swim side by side. Sometimes it pinched down to where we had to go single file with our tanks brushing the walls on both sides. About 200 feet in, Walt's light swept across an opening on the right that I almost would have missed. It was a side passage, low and narrow, the kind of thing that looks like it might dead end after 10 feet. Walt checked his compass, checked his map, the actual paper map he'd brought, laminated, the official one, and shook his head. This passage wasn't on it. He looked back at me, and I gave him the okay sign, and he tied off a new section of line and let us in. The texture of the walls changed almost immediately. The main passage walls were rough, pitted limestone, the kind that's been dissolving slowly for thousands of years, full of small ledges and cracks. This side passage was different. The walls were smoother. Not perfectly smooth, but smoother than they should have been, almost like they'd been worn down by something moving through, over and over, for a very long time. I remember running my light along the wall next to me, and thinking it looked almost polished, the way river rocks get polished. Except this was inside a cave where there shouldn't be that kind of current. Then the temperature started doing what that first diver had described. My computer is mounted on my wrist, and I have a habit of glancing at it every minute or so out of pure routine. Depth, time, temperature. Florida spring water doesn't change temperature. That's the whole point of it. But about 100 feet into that side passage, my display reads 69 degrees. A minute later, it reads 71. A minute after that, 69 again. Then 71, back and forth like clockwork, exactly the way that first diver had described it 7 months earlier. Except this time I was watching it happen with my own eyes. I looked ahead at Walt. He'd stopped swimming. He was hanging in the water, perfectly still, looking at his own computer. Then he checked it a second time, like he didn't believe the first reading. He didn't signal anything. He didn't write anything on his slate. He just turned back around and kept going. And I followed, and neither of us said a word, because there wasn't really a way to say anything that would have helped. About 40 feet further, we found him. I want to describe this carefully, because at the time, my brain didn't process it the way you'd expect. He was vertical, exactly like the footage had shown. Arms straight down at his sides. Feet pointed down, but not touching the floor of the passage. He hung at what I'd guess was mid-water, maybe 4 feet of clearance below him and 4 feet above. The yellow BC was faded but intact. The regulator was still in his mouth, the hose curving up and over his shoulder the way it's supposed to. His mask was clear, a little fogged at the edges, but clear enough. His eyes were open. I want to be honest with you. My first thought, the very first thing that went through my head, was that this looked staged. Like someone had posed a mannequin in a dive shop window. Nothing about a body that's been underwater for 39 years should look like that. No drift, no settling, no decay that I could see from where I was. He just hung there, facing slightly toward us, like he'd been waiting. Walt and I exchanged the okay signal, both a little shaky, and he gestured for me to bring up the lift bag. A deflated bag with a line attached that you fill with air underwater to provide lift for bringing something heavy to the surface. Standard recovery equipment. I swam up along the body to attach the bag's line to his gear harness, and that's when I made the mistake. Or maybe it wasn't a mistake. Maybe it was always going to happen this way, of putting my hand on his shoulder to steady myself while I worked the clip. I felt a pulse, not a flutter, not something I could have imagined or mistaken for the current. A real pulse, slow and heavy, like the whole body moved with it. One single deep beat that I felt travel up through my hand, into my arm. And for 1 second, I swear I felt it in my own chest too, like it had synced up with mine for just that beat before falling back out of rhythm. I yanked my hand back so fast I bumped into the wall behind me and kicked up a cloud of fine silt that hadn't been disturbed in who knows how long. I signaled Walt. Emergency signal, hand flat, slicing across my throat, which in diving doesn't mean what it looks like. It means something's wrong. Come here now. He was beside me in seconds. I pointed at the body's shoulder and made the signal for feel, touch check, and Walt, who I have to give credit for, didn't hesitate. He reached out and put 2 fingers against the side of the body's neck, right where you'd check a pulse on a living person, and held them there. I watched his eyes through his mask. I watched them go wide and stay wide. for a long 10 or 15 seconds. He pulled out his slate, a small whiteboard divers used to write messages underwater, and wrote 3 words, pressing hard enough that I could see the marker squeak, even though I couldn't hear it. Not possible. I took the slate, wiped it, and wrote back. We need to surface. He took it back, wiped it, and wrote. With him, I looked at the body, at Brian Kessler, at his open eyes, which hadn't moved, hadn't blinked, hadn't reacted to either of us being inches from his face with bright lights on. And I thought about that man 7 months ago who came up unable to speak. I thought about the gar that wasn't a gar, and I nodded. And I took the slate back and wrote, yes, with him. We finished attaching the lift bag. Walt filled it slowly from his backup regulator, the way you're trained to, and the body, Brian, began to rise off whatever invisible point he'd been suspended at, drifting up at a controlled rate, the line trailing back down to Walt's hand. And that's when the water changed. I felt it first as resistance, the same thing that Diver had described as thick, except now I understood what he meant. It wasn't like swimming through mud or silt. It was like the water itself had gotten heavier, like every motion took just a little more effort than it should have. The same way walking through waist-deep water on a beach takes more effort than walking on sand, except we were already in water, and water doesn't do that to itself. My computer kept cycling 6971, 6971 faster now, like it was speeding up. My primary light flickered, just once at first, a half second of darkness, and then it came back. I tapped it, the way you do when electronics misbehave, even though I knew that wouldn't fix anything if something was actually wrong with it. It flickered again, longer this time, and in that half second of darkness, before my eyes adjusted back to the light, I saw something on the walls. I almost convinced myself I hadn't, but Walt saw it too, I know because he stopped kicking entirely for a second, and his light swung toward the same section of wall I was looking at. There were patterns on the limestone, not scratches, not carvings, not the kind of thing a person could have made with a tool. They looked organic, branching lines, thinner and thinner the further they spread, the way veins look under skin, or the way a tree's roots spread out from the trunk, except these were enormous. Each branch as wide as my forearm at the thickest point, covering maybe 10 or 15 feet of wall that I could see. And they were glowing, faintly, barely enough to see, the kind of glow you'd miss completely if your light wasn't flickering on and off right next to it. A dim bluish light, pulsing, and it took me a second, with my heart going and my hands shaking on the lift bag line, to realize the pulsing pattern matched something. It matched the pulse I'd felt under my hand, the same slow rhythm. The walls of that passage were beating in time with Brian Kessler's heart. I didn't look at it again after that. I kept my eyes on Walt, on the line, on my gauges, and we ascended. The thick feeling in the water faded the further we got from that side passage. And by the time we reached the main passage again, it was gone completely, just normal, clear, 72-degree spring water, the way it had been on the way in. My computer settled back to a steady reading and stayed there. Whatever had been happening back in that side passage, it stayed back in that side passage, at least for the moment. We surfaced at the head spring a little over 40 minutes after we'd gone down. I'd called it in before we even left the dock that morning. Possible body recovery, county and state both notified, paramedics standing by, the whole protocol. They were waiting on the bank when we came up, and I will never forget the look on the lead paramedic's face when Walt and I broke the surface, each of us holding onto Brian Kessler, keeping him upright between us the way you'd support someone who couldn't stand on their own, because his eyes were still open. And the paramedics could see that from the bank, before we even got him out of the water. They got him onto a backboard on the dock. One of them, a young guy who I don't think had been doing this job very long, pressed 2 fingers to Kessler's neck out of pure habit, the same thing Walt had done, and his hand froze there, and he looked up at the senior paramedic and said, "I've got a pulse." The senior one didn't believe him at first. Neither did I, even though I already knew. They hooked up a heart monitor, and it took them almost 5 full minutes to get a reading they trusted, because the machine kept registering long stretches of flat line and then suddenly catching a single beat, then going flat again, over and over. Eventually they figured out it wasn't the machine malfunctioning. It was reading correctly. The heart was beating, just once every 4 minutes or so, the exact rhythm I'd felt underwater. His core body temperature, when they checked it, read 72 degrees, exactly the temperature of the spring water. Not hypothermic in the sense of being dangerously cold for a living person, just matched to the water, like he'd settled into it the way the water itself settles into that temperature, deep in the aquifer, year after year, no matter what's happening on the surface. And when they removed his regulator to check his airway, he didn't gasp. He didn't choke. He didn't do anything that a person who'd just been pulled out of the water after 39 years would do. His chest kept moving, slow, shallow, in and out on some rhythm of its own, but no air went in or out through his mouth or nose. They suctioned fluid from his airway to clear it, the way you would with a drowning victim, and the fluid that came out wasn't quite right. It was clear, like water, but it had a texture to it, slightly thicker, the senior paramedic said, like saline that hadn't been mixed all the way. They got him into the ambulance and took him to Shands Hospital up in Gainesville, about 40 minutes away. Walt and I rode back to the ranger station in his truck, neither of us saying much. At one point he said, 30 years, 14 bodies. I've never had one of them have a pulse. He laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh. Guess there's a first time for everything. I didn't laugh. I was thinking about Hutto and about the spring keeping what it needed. Over the next 2 days, I stayed in touch with the hospital through official channels. As the ranger who'd been part of the recovery, I was a point of contact for updates. Since Brian Kessler's case was now technically reopened after 36 years, and somebody had to be the liaison. What I learned over those 2 days, I learned in pieces, and each piece made less sense than the one before it. The fluid from his lungs went to a lab for analysis. The results came back strange enough that the lab ran them twice, assuming contamination. It wasn't contamination. The fluid was water-based, similar in mineral content to the aquifer water that feeds the spring, but it contained something else. Cellular material, the lab report said, that didn't match any known classification. Not bacteria, not algae or fungus, not anything in the existing taxonomic record, which for a microbiologist is apparently about as unsettling a sentence as you can write in a report. The cells were alive, they were active, and whatever they were doing it without oxygen, which, again, according to the lab, shouldn't be possible for anything that complex. Brian's own cells, the ones that were unmistakably human, showed something the doctors couldn't explain either. No decay, none. 39 years underwater, and at a cellular level, his body looked like it belonged to someone who'd been alive and healthy the entire time. Just paused. That was the word one of the doctors used to me on the phone, and then he immediately backtracked and said that wasn't a medical term. And he didn't mean it literally, but I could hear in his voice that he didn't have a better word, either. The second day, 2 things happened, and I didn't connect them at first, because they seemed like they belonged to completely different categories of problem. The first thing was that the park's water flow readings came back wrong. Ichtuckney has monitoring equipment on the head spring that tracks flow rate continuously. It's part of how the state manages the whole river system, because that spring water feeds the Santa Fe, and the Santa Fe feeds farms and towns downstream. The readings showed a drop of about 12% from the spring's normal output. 12% doesn't sound like much until you remember the baseline is 233 million gallons a day. 12% of that is around 28 million gallons a day, just gone, with no rainfall change, no upstream issue, nothing in the data that explained it. The hydrologist who called me about it sounded more confused than worried. Springs just don't do that, not over the course of a single day, not without some massive event like an earthquake or a sinkhole collapse. And there'd been neither. The second thing was that Brian started to change. I wasn't there for most of it. I was back at the park, dealing with the fact that our head spring, for the first time in the recorded history of that park, was turning cloudy, visibly cloudy. Tourists were asking why the famous clear water looked like it had milk stirred into it. I didn't have an answer for them. I closed the head spring to swimming for water quality testing, which technically wasn't a lie, and I spent that whole day watching that water get worse, a little at a time, while fish, small ones at first, then bigger ones, started turning up dead in the spring run, just floating on their sides, no visible cause. The hospital called me that evening. A nurse on Brian's floor, I'll call her by her first name, Renee, because she gave me permission to use it when I talked to her later, before she got transferred out of state, told me his skin had started drying out. Not in the normal way skin dries, flaking or cracking from dehydration. She said it was more like watching something settle, like watching wet sand dry on a beach, except it was happening to a person's arm in real time over the course of an afternoon. And as it dried, patterns started showing up under the skin. Faint at first, she said, like bruising, except they weren't bruise-colored. They were the same branching shape I'd seen on the cave wall, thinner near his hands and feet, thicker up near his chest, like a river system mapped out across his body. By that evening, under the hospital's fluorescent lights, with the room lights dimmed for the night shift. Renee said she could see them glowing. Just barely. The same dim blue I'd seen in that passage. She told me she'd been doing his vitals check around 11 that night, alone in the room, and Brian Kessler, who in 39 years had never moved, never blinked, never reacted to anything, turned his head, just slightly, toward her, and he spoke. She had her phone in her scrub pocket, and something, she told me later she didn't even decide to do it. Her hand just moved, made her pull it out and hit record. She played the recording for me once, only once, and she wouldn't let me copy it. And I understand why, because after I heard it I didn't want to copy either. It wasn't really a voice. That's the best way I can describe it. It had words in it, 3 words, clear enough to understand, but underneath the words, or maybe wrapped around them, there was a sound like water moving through pipes, that hollow, echoing gurgle you hear in old plumbing, except drawn out, stretched to match the rhythm of speech. He said, "Put me back, that's all." 3 words, and then his head turned away again, back to where it had been, and his eyes, which had been open the entire 39 years, the entire 2 days in the hospital, stayed open, staring at the ceiling, same as always. Renee told me she didn't sleep that night. I don't think I did either, once she told me. I lay awake going over everything, the cloudy water, the dead fish, the flow rate dropping, the patterns on his skin matching the patterns on the cave wall, the pulse that matched the glow that matched his heartbeat, and somewhere around 3 in the morning, lying in my bed in the ranger housing, listening to the air conditioning cycle on and off, it all lined up in my head at once, the way a puzzle does, when you finally see the picture instead of just the pieces. The spring wasn't failing because of some unrelated problem that happened to occur. At the same time we pulled Brian Kessler out of the water. The spring was failing because we pulled Brian Kessler out of the water. I don't know how to fully explain what that water is, or what's actually living in those deep chambers of the aquifer, the parts no diver has ever reached and probably never will. I don't think anyone knows, not really, not even now. But whatever it is, it had Brian, and it had him in a way that was part of how the whole system worked, the way one part of a body needs another part to keep functioning, even if neither part fully understands the other. And we'd taken him out, and the system was responding the way a body responds when something's been removed that shouldn't have been. I thought about the families downstream who depend on that river. I thought about the fish, the ones already dead, and the ones that would be next. I thought about the cracks that had started showing up in the boardwalk over the headspring that same day. Small ones, hairline, but new, in wood that had been solid the week before, like the ground underneath was settling. And I thought about Brian Kessler, 39 years old forever, lying in a hospital bed with his eyes open, asking, in a voice made of water and pipes, to go back to the only place that had kept him from rotting away to nothing for almost 4 decades. I got up, I got dressed, I drove to Gainesville. I'm a federal-level law enforcement ranger, which gave me more authority in that situation than people might expect. Enough, at least, to walk into a hospital at 3 in the morning, badge first, and have a quiet, firm conversation with the night charge nurse about a discharge against medical advice for a patient connected to an active law enforcement matter. I'm not going to walk through exactly how that conversation went, because I'm still not entirely proud of it, and because some of what I said wasn't, strictly speaking, true. But it worked. Within 40 minutes, I had Brian Kessler, wrapped in a hospital gown and 2 blankets, his open eyes the only part of him not covered, the faint blue glow under his skin visible even through the fabric, loaded into the back of my truck. I drove back to Ichtucknee with the windows down the whole way, even though it was cold for Florida that night, because I couldn't stand being in a closed space with him, not because I was afraid of him, exactly. I think it was more that being near him felt like being near something that was in pain, in a way that had nothing to do with how it looked or sounded, and I didn't want to sit with that any longer than I had to. The park was closed, gates locked, not a single light on except the safety lighting along the main road. I carried him from the parking lot to the headspring myself. He wasn't heavy, not really, lighter than I expected for a grown man. Like some of what should have been there just wasn't anymore, and I walked out onto the boardwalk, past the cracks that had widened just since that afternoon, to the edge of the water. The headspring at night, with no tourists and no lights except what the moon gave us, looked the way it must have looked for thousands of years before anyone built a boardwalk over it. Black water, except right at the center, over the deepest part, the part everyone calls the blue hole. Where the main cave opening sits, there was a faint glow coming up from below. The same blue, Brian's blue. I knelt down at the edge and lowered him into the water. His eyes were open the whole time, looking up at me. And I want to be honest. I talked to him. I don't remember everything I said. I think I told him I was sorry. I think I told him I hoped this was what he wanted, even though wanted feels like the wrong word for whatever was actually going on with him by that point. I let him go, and he didn't sink the way a body sinks, slow, tumbling, fighting the water a little on the way down. He just descended, smooth and straight, exactly the way he'd been hanging in that passage when we found him, arms at his sides, feet pointed down, drawn toward that glow at the bottom, like he was being gently pulled by something that had been waiting. Within a couple of minutes, and I stood there and watched the whole time, because I needed to see it. The water around me started to clear. I could see it happening, right there in the dark, the cloudiness lifting like smoke being pulled out through a vent, until the moonlight was hitting the sandy bottom again, 25 feet down, the way it was supposed to. By morning, the flow rate readings were back to normal. All 233 million gallons, like nothing had ever happened. I filed a report. I want to be clear that I did file one. I've never lied about what happened, not to the people who needed to know. The report went up through the state, and within about a week, it came back down with a classification stamp on it from the Department of Environmental Protection, the kind of stamp that means the report exists, but almost nobody will ever be allowed to read it. Brian Kessler's hospital records got sealed the same week. Renee, the nurse, got transferred to a hospital up in North Georgia about 10 days after that. A great opportunity, her transfer letter called it. More money, better unit. She didn't ask for it. I called her once, a few months later, just to check in, and she told me she didn't want to talk about any of it anymore. And I understood, and I didn't call again. I'm still at Itchtuckney. I requested to stay, actually, when my district supervisor asked if I wanted a transfer somewhere else. Somewhere fresh, he called it, which I think was his way of offering me an exit without having to say why. I told him I was fine where I was. I still do my walkthrough every day. I still check the boardwalk for cracks. There are a couple that never fully went away, hairline ones, right near the rail over the deepest part. And every few months maintenance comes out and patches them. And every few months they come back. Nobody else seems to notice. Maybe they don't look as closely as I do. Sometimes in the evening, right around dusk, the light hits the head spring at just the right angle. Low sun, water dead calm, no wind, and you can see all the way down to the bottom, the way the brochures say you're supposed to be able to. Down to the sand, down to the dark opening of the blue hole where the cave begins. And down there at the bottom, in the dark part where the cave starts, there's a glow, faint, blue, steady except for a slow pulse, every few minutes, like something breathing. I've stood on that boardwalk plenty of evenings and watched it. I've never reported it. I'm not sure who I'd even tell or what I'd say or what good it would do. I tell myself I saved the spring. I tell myself that water feeds the river, and the river feeds the farms and the towns downstream, and a lot of people depend on that water without ever thinking about where it comes from, and what I did kept all of that running the way it's supposed to. I tell myself it was the right thing to do, and most days I believe it. But some nights, lying awake, I think about that diver who came up 7 months before Brian, the one who saw something on the floor of that chamber and wouldn't say what it was, and never came back. I think about the thing I saw in the cavern zone my first month there, the vertical shape with the pale, unmoving eyes that I told myself was a gar, and never wrote down and never went looking for again. I think about that case file Walt pulled up. One diver, one name, one date, 39 years missing, finally found. Florida's been full of cave divers for a long time. A lot of them have gone into systems like Itchtuckney's and never come back out. Most of those cases get closed the same way Brian's was. Presumed drowning, body never recovered, and nobody ever goes looking again. Because there's nothing left to look for. No body, no gear, no reason to send anyone back down. So I wonder sometimes, lying awake, how many other divers are still down there? And were they all put back too?